All right, today we're going to dive into the incredible story of Harshad Mehta. We're talking about a stockbroker who pulled off a scam so massive, it literally brought the entire Indian stock market to its knees.
I mean, just think about that number for a second. It's staggering. So the big question is, how on earth did one guy, a single stockbroker, get so powerful that his collapse could wipe out 100,000 crores in market value? It's just wild.
Well, the answer really starts with this number, 4,000 crore rupees. That's the estimated amount Harshad Mehta managed to illegally pull right out of the country's banking system. And get this, he was using the bank's own money to game the stock market.
So to really get the full picture of the impact here, we've got to rewind to 1992. Now, this was a year that kicked off with this insane stock market boom, but you guessed it, it ended in an absolutely devastating crash. And the fall was, well, it was beyond dramatic. Before the scam was exposed, the Sensex had rocketed up to a peak of 4,500. But once that bubble burst, it plummeted all the way down to 2,500. Just imagine, for thousands of regular people, their entire life savings just, poof, vanished. Practically overnight.
So, who was the architect of all this chaos? Well, it's time to meet the man they called the Big Bull of Dalal Street himself, Harshad Mehta.
You know, his story at first really sounds like something out of a movie. He came from a pretty modest Gujarati Jain family, and he started out doing all sorts of odd jobs, a sales clerk here, an insurance agent there. But then he discovered the stock market, and everything changed. His rise wasn't just fast, it was absolutely meteoric.
And boy, did he live the part. We're not just talking rich, we're talking about a sprawling 15,000 square foot penthouse in Worli, one of Mumbai's fanciest neighborhoods. I mean, it had its own swimming pool, even a mini-golf course. And the cars? He had a whole fleet of luxury cars, including a Toyota Lexus that cost 40 lakh rupees. And remember, this was back in the early 90s. He really was the poster boy for India's new money.
Okay, so how in the world did he actually pull this off? The scam itself was pretty complex, but don't worry, we're going to break it down. At its core, it all came down to him finding and exploiting a few key loopholes in the banking system. Okay, so the first piece of this puzzle is something called a ready forward deal, or RF deal. Now, this sounds complicated, but it's really just a fancy term for a super short-term loan between banks. Think of it like one bank pawning its government bonds to another for some quick cash. And who was right in the middle of all these deals, acting as the broker? You got it, Harshad Mehta.
Now, pay attention, because this next part is absolutely critical. Back then, instead of physically moving around giant stacks of bond certificates, which was a huge pain, banks used something called a bank receipt, a BR. It was basically just an IOU, a simple slip of paper saying, yep, we're holding these bonds for you. And that little piece of paper, that was the loophole. A loophole so big, Harshad Mehta drove a fleet of trucks right through.
So here's how he weaponized those little pieces of paper. It's a four-step cycle. First, he'd go to smaller, less scrutinized banks and get them to issue fake bank receipts, IOUs for bonds that didn't even exist. Why would they do it? Huge commissions, of course. Second, he'd take those completely worthless BRs to the big, respectable banks and use them as collateral to get massive loans. Third, he'd take all that cash he just borrowed and funnel it straight into the stock market, artificially pumping up the prices of certain stocks. And fourth, he'd sell everything at the top, rake in a massive profit, and then just start the whole cycle over again. Genius, right? And totally illegal. And the effect this had on the market was just insane. Let's just take one stock as an example, ACC, or Associated Cement Companies. Before Mehta got involved, a share was trading for about 200 rupees. At its absolute peak, fueled by all that fake money, it hit 9,000 rupees. That is a 4,400% surge. He basically created his own personal bull market for stocks like Apollo Tires, Reliance, Videocon, you name it. But here's the thing about a scheme like this. It's a house of cards. And you know what happens to a house of cards, right? It was only a matter of time before the whole thing came crashing down. And when it did, it came down hard and fast.
The first domino toppled in April 1992. That's when the journalist Sucheta Dalal bravely exposed the whole thing in the Times of India. Suddenly, the music stopped. Banks started panicking, demanding their money back. By November of that same year, the SEBI arrested Mehta and his brothers. The legal battles dragged on for years, but he was finally convicted in 1999. And then, on New Year's Eve 2001, he died in prison from a heart attack. He was only 47.
And the legal fallout was just immense. I mean, we're not talking about 1 or 2 charges here. In total, Harshad Mehta was slapped with an unbelievable 72 separate criminal charges. We're talking fraud, misappropriation. Basically, the entire book was thrown at him.
This whole scandal was a massive shock to the system for India, a real national trauma. But, sometimes you need a crisis like that to force change. It was a brutal wake-up call that forced a complete top-to-bottom overhaul of the entire Indian financial system. You can actually see the scam's legacy in the massive reforms that came right after. The National Stock Exchange, the NSE, was created to bring in transparent electronic trading. The regulator, SEBI, was finally given some real power, some actual teeth to enforce the rules. That whole shaky bank receipt system completely overhauled. And maybe most importantly, we got dematerialized, or electronic trading, that killed the need for those physical IOUs that Mehta exploited so masterfully. Of course, his story also became this legendary cautionary tale, inspiring TV shows and movies that people are still watching today. And all of this brings us back to that one lingering question. Who was Harshad Mehta really? Was he some kind of master criminal, a once-in-a-generation predator who single-handedly broke the system? Or was he just a brilliant, incredibly ambitious guy who saw a system riddled with loopholes and simply took advantage of them? It's a debate that people still have, and it's probably the most enduring legacy of the Big Bull.